My son looked me in the eye and said, "From now on, your salary goes straight to my account. You don't need anything anyway." I just smiled and quietly agreed. To him, I was just an old woman, weak, forgetful, and too soft to say no. He thought he could take everything, my money, my home, even my dignity. But what he didn't know was I'd been planning for this moment for a very long time. That night, like every week, he and his wife came over for their free dinner, laughing, careless, confident. I served the meal I'd cooked with shaking hands, though not from fear. I was waiting. Because tonight, they would see who I really am. And when they walked into my dining room, they froze. His wife gasped. My son's smile vanished as his face went white. Because on the table right next to the pot roast was a folder with his name on it, and inside was everything he thought he'd hidden from me. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about a mother who turned heartbreak into justice, and by the end, he'd lose far more than just my salary. My name is Mary Thompson. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in the same small house on the edge of town for more than 30 years. After my husband George passed away 5 years ago, I decided to keep working part-time at the local library. It isn't about the money, though the few $100s a month help, but because I like the quiet hum of the place, the smell of old books, and the small talk with people who still remember my husband's kind smile. Life has slowed down, but it's still mine, and I like to think I manage it well enough on my own. Most mornings are simple. I get up early, make coffee, and watch the light slide through the kitchen curtains onto the table George built himself. The garden outside still blooms with the roses he planted, yellow ones, because he said they looked like sunshine, even on cloudy days. I keep the place tidy, the bills paid, the meals simple. Some nights I sit with a book in my lap and think, maybe this is all an old woman needs, a quiet house, a bit of peace and memories that don't hurt too much anymore. Every Friday, though, that peace shifts. That's the day my son David and his family come to visit. I say visit because that's what David calls it, though we both know what it really is. A free dinner, a little comfort for them, and a show of family togetherness for me. I always cook too much pot roast, mashed potatoes, sometimes apple pie if I have the energy. It's silly, I suppose, but cooking for my son still makes me feel like a mother with purpose. David is 42 now, tall like his father, but with a sharp edge George never had. He works in sales, always chasing a promotion that never quite comes. His wife Karen is polite but distant. She spends most of dinner on her phone, scrolling through pictures of expensive homes or vacations she'll never take. They're kids. Emma and Jake are good children, teenagers already full of laughter and questions, but their father doesn't let them linger too long after we eat. Friday nights are supposed to be family time, but lately I can feel how different it's become. David arrives with a tired smile, hugs me loosely if he remembers to, and drops his coat on the back of a chair like he still lives here. Karen sighs about how expensive everything is, about the car payment, about how Mom, you're lucky you don't have to worry about all this. They eat, they talk mostly about themselves, and when dinner is done, they leave their plates on the table. I clean the kitchen alone like I've done for years and watch their taillights fade down the street. It's funny, the things a mother notices. The way her child avoids her eyes. The way his voice turns impatient when she forgets a detail he thinks she should remember. The way the word Mom sounds more like an obligation than affection. There's something colder about David lately. Something calculating. He looks around my house as if he's taking inventory. Karen doesn't say much to me, though. I catch her looking at my furniture, my shelves, my garden. I once heard her tell Emma, "Your grandma's house is big for one person. Maybe one day you'll live somewhere nice like this." She said it lightly, like a joke, but it stayed in my mind. The kids still make me smile. Emma loves reading. She reminds me of myself at her age, and Jake likes helping in the garden. When they try to linger after dinner, David calls from the car. "Let's go, kids," and the moment breaks. They always wave from the window, and I wave back, pretending it's enough. Last Friday was no different, or so I thought. I spent all day cooking, setting the table with the good china, the kind I save for when I want things to feel special. They came, they ate, they laughed a little too loudly. David checked his phone constantly, even during dinner, and when I asked if everything was all right, he just said, "Work stuff, Mom. Don't worry." When they left, I stood at the doorway like always, waving, holding on to the small warmth of family that faded as their car turned the corner. The next morning, I was sweeping the porch when I saw it, a white envelope caught under the hedge near the steps. I bent down and picked it up. My eyesight isn't what it used to be, but the bold red letters were impossible to miss. Final notice, debt collection, urgent. My heart tightened. It had David's name on it. I thought maybe I shouldn't look, that it was his private matter. So I didn't open it. But something heavy settled in my chest. I called him just to let him know. "David, honey, you dropped some mail last night," I said. He sighed, sharp and dismissive. "Just throw it away, Mom. It's junk mail." Then he hung up. That night I couldn't sleep. The house felt too quiet. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the tick of the old clock on the wall. At 2 a.m, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from David. "Just one sentence, Mom, I'm coming over tomorrow. We need to talk about your finances. It's important." I didn't reply. I just stared at the screen, the glow of it lighting the dark room. Something in me knew whatever this was, it wasn't about love, and it wasn't going to be good. By the next afternoon, the air in the house felt different. I tried to read, to make soup, to lose myself in something ordinary, but I kept glancing at the clock. David said he'd come over after lunch. I set out 2 cups and boiled the kettle anyway, though I had a feeling he wouldn't want tea. When the knock finally came, it was sharp. 2 quick raps, not his usual lazy tap. I opened the door to see him standing there alone, no Karen, no kids. He looked tired, eyes shadowed, his mouth set in that tight, businesslike line he uses when he's already made up his mind. "Hi, Mom," he said, stepping inside before I could invite him. His laptop bag swung from his shoulder. He didn't take off his coat. "Where's Karen?" I asked. "She's not feeling well," he said quickly, though his voice didn't sound concerned. "Let's just sit for a minute. I need to talk to you about something important." I followed him into the kitchen. The sunlight came through the lace curtains, soft and golden, falling over the table, where he was already setting up his laptop. The kettle clicked off behind me, but when I asked if he wanted tea, he just shook his head. "No thanks. Let's get this done." Get this done, as if he were handling paperwork for a client, not speaking to his mother. He opened a folder on the screen, cleared his throat, and said, "Mom, I need to be added as a joint holder on your checking account." I blinked. "A what?" "A joint holder," he repeated slower, like I might not understand. "Your pension and salary deposits should go into an account we both control. It's safer that way." "Safer?" I asked, my voice quiet. He sighed, tapping something on the keyboard. "Mom, you're 68. What if you fall? What if someone scams you? I need to be able to access your money to help you manage it. It's for your own protection." His tone was smooth, too smooth. He'd rehearsed this. "David," I said softly, "I still work. I pay my bills. I'm not confused about anything." He gave a little laugh that wasn't a laugh at all. "I know, Mom, but it's not about confusion. It's about being practical. Everyone your age should have someone to help. Look, I've already talked to the bank. All you need to do is sign these forms." He turned the laptop toward me and slid a pen across the table. On the screen was an online form labeled Joint Account Authorization. Below my name in bold letters was his David Thompson co-owner with full access. My chest tightened. "You've already talked to the bank." "Yes," he said quickly. "They just need your signature. It'll make things so much easier. I'll get alerts on your transactions. Pay your bills on time. Make sure no one takes advantage of you." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't a son's smile. It was the practiced grin of a man closing a deal. I folded my hands in my lap. "You think I can't handle my own money?" His jaw tightened. "Mom, don't make this difficult. I'm doing this to protect you. You're not getting any younger. Last week, you forgot Jake's birthday." That stung not because it was true, it wasn't, but because he said it so easily, like it was fact. I'd bought Jake a book he wanted and wrapped it myself. He'd hugged me and said thank you. But David wasn't interested in truth. He was trying to make me doubt myself. I took a breath. "I remember Jake's birthday." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, please, don't start. I'm trying to help you. Why are you being so stubborn? Do you want strangers handling your money instead of your own son?" There it was, the guilt. The one thing he knew might work. I looked at him, at this man who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers, who used to cry when he scraped his knee. Now he sat in my kitchen talking to me like a burden, a liability. I looked down at the screen again. My hand trembled slightly, though not from fear, just from the weight of what I was about to do. Slowly, I reached for the pen. "All right, David," I said softly. "If it makes you feel better." Relief flooded his face. "Good. Good, this'll be much simpler. I'll submit it to the bank tomorrow. You won't have to worry about a thing." I signed my name neat and small, my hand shaking just enough to look frail. When I handed the pen back, he closed the laptop quickly, like he couldn't wait to get out before I changed my mind. He kissed my cheek absently, his lips cold, and said, "Thanks, Mom. You'll see, this is for the best." Then he was gone. The house was silent again. I stood by the window watching his car back out of the driveway. The tires crunched against the gravel, and for a long time I just stood there staring at the empty space he left behind. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry, just hollow, the way an old tree feels when it's been carved too many times. After a while, I walked to my bedroom. The late afternoon light slanted across the carpet, catching the edge of my sewing cabinet. I opened it and pulled out the old wooden box I hadn't touched in years. It smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Inside was our wedding photo me in Lace George, in a gray suit, with a sunflower pinned to his lapel. Beneath it was a small yellowed envelope, my name written in his handwriting. I sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the letter carefully, afraid it might crumble after all these years. The ink had faded a little, but his words were still clear, still strong. "My dearest Mary, if David ever forgets what family means, don't just forgive him. Teach him. Everything you need is in the attic. I love you. George." I read that line 3 times, the words blurring as my eyes filled. The paper trembled in my hands, thin and fragile, like the last trace of the man I'd shared my whole life with. George had always known how to prepare for everything, a man who labeled storage boxes, kept copies of receipts from 20 years ago, who never left the garage light on overnight. But how could he have prepared for this? For our son to look at me as a burden, to strip me of my independence in the name of protection. Somehow he had. Somehow he'd seen this coming before I ever could. I set the letter down beside the photograph of our wedding day. The flicker of the candlelight made it almost look like he was smiling at me again, standing tall in his gray suit, with that sunflower pinned to his lapel. For a long moment, I sat there, hands clasped in my lap, feeling the weight of 50 years of love, motherhood loss, and quiet patience. Maybe George had known that patience unchecked could turn into silence. And silence, when faced with greed, became permission. By the time I blew out the candle, I had made a decision. Tomorrow, I would go to the attic. I hadn't been up there in years. It was too full of dust and memories. George's old tools, Christmas boxes, a few of David's childhood things. I'd always told myself I was too old to climb those stairs. But that night, lying in bed, I didn't feel old. I felt something else entirely. Awake. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, and I found myself up before 7. I made a cup of tea, tied back my hair, and pulled on the sturdy shoes I used for gardening. When I opened the attic door, a wave of musty air greeted me, carrying the faint smell of cedar and dust. The wooden steps creaked under my feet, but they held just like they always had. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust. Boxes stacked neatly, old furniture draped in sheets. The rocking horse David had begged George to build one Christmas long ago. And in the far corner, half hidden behind a trunk, was the metal box. It was about the size of a bread loaf, dark with age but solid. A small combination lock clung to the handle, its numbers faded but readable. I remembered the line in George's letter our anniversary. July 15th, 1979. My hands didn't shake this time as I turned the dial. E0715. There was a soft click. I lifted the lid and caught my breath. Inside, everything was wrapped in crisp envelopes, neatly labeled in George's handwriting. Savings account passbooks, stock certificates, the house deed with only my name listed, life insurance documents, and tucked beneath them a small leather-bound notebook filled with George's financial notes, investment summaries, contact names, even instructions about asset transfers. The air in the attic felt suddenly lighter. All these years I'd lived quietly, thinking I was surviving modestly on my pension and part-time job, never realizing George had left me more than comfort. He'd left me security. Protection. A safety net David didn't even know existed. I carried the box downstairs to the dining table and sat there for a long time flipping through the papers. George had been smart, methodical, cautious. But so was I. Looking at his careful handwriting, I felt something stirring inside me. Something I hadn't felt in decades, purpose. As I traced the numbers and legal terms, memories returned like an old melody I hadn't realized I still knew. The sound of typing in the Morrison & Associates office in Hartford. The heavy smell of coffee and printer ink. My younger self. Mary Henderson sitting across from wealthy clients, advising them on estate planning and tax strategies. I had been a CPA, then a certified public accountant. For years, I'd specialized in asset protection trusts and inheritance law. I'd left that life when I had David, thinking motherhood was my new full-time calling. I never imagined those old skills would matter again. But now they felt like armor. I smiled softly, realizing something I should have known all along: I wasn't helpless. David might think of me as a frail old woman who needed managing. But beneath the soft voice and the polite smiles, there was someone else entirely, a woman who'd spent years navigating complex financial webs and seeing through the greed of men who thought they were smarter than she was. I took a yellow legal pad from the drawer and began to write. On one side of the page, what David knows. Pension. Part-time salary. The house he thinks he can sell someday. On the other, what David doesn't know. George's savings. The stocks. The insurance. My professional past. When I finished, I looked at the two columns, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel small. I felt steady, grounded. I picked up the old landline phone from the wall, the one David had told me I should get rid of, because nobody uses those anymore. I turned to the back of George's notebook, scanning the list of names. One stood out, Walter Mitchell, George's old college friend, a lawyer. We'd met him once years ago at a barbecue. Sharp, kind, trustworthy. George must have known I'd need someone like him one day. I found the number written in neat pen strokes, the ink faded but clear. I hesitated for just a moment, then dialed. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered, steady and familiar, even after all these years. Walter Mitchell speaking. I took a breath, my voice calm and unwavering. Walter, it's Mary Thompson. I need your help. No, not for me. For my son. Before he makes the biggest mistake of his life. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, everything has changed, though. David doesn't know it yet. I took Walter's advice to heart. Stay quiet, observe, and let him believe he's in control. The key, Walter said, was patience. And patience, I've learned, can look a lot like weakness to people who underestimate you. At first, I thought maybe David would calm down after getting access to my account. Maybe once he saw how little I spent, he'd stop worrying about protecting me. But that's not what happened. The opposite did. It started small, a phone call one morning while I was making oatmeal. Mom, I noticed a charge from the farmer's market. He said, voice clipped. Why are you shopping there? It's more expensive than Walmart. I told him I liked their fresh produce. It reminded me of the garden his father used to keep. He sighed, like I was a child who hadn't learned a simple rule. You need to be more careful. Starting next week, I'm transferring only $100 to your card each week. That should be plenty. For my own money. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. Instead, I thanked him softly and hung up. That night, I wrote down the date and time in my notebook, just like Walter told me to. Document everything he'd said. If he ever crosses a line, the details will matter. The following week was Jake's birthday. I'd been planning it for months. He was turning 13, and I wanted him to feel special. I decorated the backyard with blue and gold balloons, baked his favorite chocolate cake, and cooked enough food for everyone. It was a perfect spring afternoon, warm sunlight, kids running in the yard, laughter in the air. For a little while, I almost forgot the tension that had crept into my life. David arrived with Karen and the kids, carrying his usual air of self-importance. He hugged me quickly, more out of habit than affection, and immediately began looking around like a man checking the value of a house. Karen smiled politely, though her eyes looked tired. The party went on, and for a moment, it almost felt normal. When it was time for gifts, I handed Jake a wrapped box. His face lit up as he tore off the paper and saw the gaming console he'd been dreaming about. Grandma. No way, he shouted, throwing his arms around me. His excitement was contagious. Even the other kids cheered. But then I saw David's face. He'd picked up the receipt that had slipped out of the box. $400. His voice cut through the chatter like a blade. Mom, where did you get the money for this? The yard went quiet. Even the kids stopped laughing. I used my credit card, I said calmly. The one I've always had. David's eyes narrowed. Which card? The one I opened years ago, I said. It's not connected to our joint account. He walked toward me, hand outstretched. Give it to me. David. Now, Mom. Everyone was staring. Karen whispered, David, not here, but he ignored her. I opened my wallet, slowly handed him the card. He held it up like it was evidence of a crime. Mom, you can't be trusted with credit anymore. You'll run yourself into trouble. And before I could speak, he tore the card in half. The sound of it, that sharp, ugly rip, seemed to echo louder than any shout could have. I could feel every eye on me, Karen's face, pale with embarrassment, Emma's lips pressed tight, Jake's confused eyes darting between us, and 5 of his little friends frozen, unsure what to do. "David," Karen said under her breath. "Please." He waved her off. "This is for her own good. She doesn't understand how easily people her age get scammed." I smiled faintly, my voice soft and even. "You're right, David. I should be more careful." That was all I said. No argument, no anger. But inside, something shifted. Not just hurt, but clarity. He didn't see his mother anymore. He saw a problem to fix, a responsibility to manage. He thought that because I stayed quiet, I had surrendered. He had no idea that my silence was a shield. After the guests left, I cleaned the house in the soft light of evening. Balloons wilted in the corners. The smell of cake still lingered in the air. I sat at the kitchen table, took out my phone, and opened the app Walter had installed for me. Every word David said had been recorded. The tone, the volume, the exact moment of humiliation, all of it captured clearly. I photographed the torn card, the receipts, even the leftover decorations. Evidence, Walter had said, doesn't just prove what happened. It shows how it made you feel. I labeled the folder on my computer. Evidence, then opened my notebook and wrote March 15th, public humiliation. Card destroyed. Witnesses, Karen, Emma, Jake, 5 minors. Possible elder abuse claim. When I closed the book, my hands were steady. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him, not of being alone, because for the first time I had proof, not just of what he did, but of who he was becoming. 2 days later, while watering plants outside, I found another envelope blown under the porch steps. This one was stamped Credit Union, foreclosure warning, and it was addressed to David's home address. My heart sank as I turned the envelope over in my hands. I didn't open it, of course. I didn't have to. The red letters told me everything. David was in trouble. More trouble than he'd ever admit. I placed it gently in the kitchen drawer next to George's old screwdriver and a pile of unpaid utility bills that were actually paid, just kept for order. Then I stood there for a long moment, staring out the window at the garden. George's roses were starting to bloom again, stubborn things pushing through the dirt even after winter tried to kill them. I wondered if that was what survival looked like. Quiet persistence. On Thursday evening, just as I was settling down with a cup of tea, my phone rang. It was David. His voice was tight, rushed like someone who'd been running. "Mom, I'm coming over tomorrow. There are some papers you need to sign." What kind of papers, I asked, though I already felt a prickle of unease. "It's just a power of attorney form," he said quickly. "It's for legal protection. It'll make things easier if something happens to you." "Power of attorney," I repeated. "What does that mean exactly?" "It just means if you're ever sick or can't make decisions, I can handle things for you. It's standard. Everyone your age does it." The words "everyone your age" rolled off his tongue like a practiced line. I could almost hear the script in his voice. I told him, "All right, come tomorrow, we'll talk about it." After I hung up, I sat there in silence, the tea cooling between my hands. I wasn't afraid anymore, not really. Just sad. Sad that my son thought manipulation sounded like love. The next evening, right on time, David showed up. This time, Karen came with him. She looked pale and nervous, clutching her purse too tightly. David, on the other hand, was all energy, all motion. He set his laptop bag on the kitchen table and started unpacking papers before I could even offer them tea. "Here," he said, pulling out a neat stack of documents. "This is the durable power of attorney. You just sign here, and I'll take care of the notarization next week." I sat down across from him, adjusting my reading glasses. You seem anxious, David. Everything all right? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Everything's fine. Just busy. We're handling a lot right now. That's when his phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a caller ID credit union. Urgent. I caught the name before he flipped it over face down and silenced it. Who's that? I asked softly. Work stuff, he said too quickly. Mom, can we focus? Please? I've already filled in most of this. Just your signature, okay? I nodded and picked up the pen. I let my hands tremble slightly. Not an act, really, but a reminder to him of how he saw me. Weak, old, trusting, the perfect target. What does this part mean? I asked, tapping one of the paragraphs. He leaned over impatiently. It just gives me authority to make financial decisions if you're unable to. You don't need to read every line, Mom. It's standard language. Karen was watching us. Her lips pressed together. I saw her glance again at his phone, still glowing faintly. There was fear in her eyes, not of me, but of something closing in on them. Are you sure this is necessary? I asked again. Yes, he snapped. Just sign, Mom. Trust me. So I did. Slowly, carefully, but not where he thought. Instead of the principal line, I signed my name neatly on the line marked Witness. My pulse was steady. I knew this document meant nothing until notarized, and even then, only if correctly executed. He didn't notice. He was too focused on the illusion of victory. When I handed him the papers, he exhaled loudly, relief flooding his face. Good. That's done. I'll get this notarized next week and file it. He began gathering his things quickly, avoiding my eyes. Karen stood there awkwardly, glancing between us. When David went to use the restroom, she stayed by the counter pulling out her phone. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but her voice was soft and worried, and in my own home, her words came through clear. I don't know, she whispered. He says it's the only way. Yes, I know it's her house, but what choice do we have? The bank is threatening to take ours. They've already sent the final notice. My heart tightened. She was talking to someone, maybe her sister, maybe a friend. The truth came into focus then, sharp as glass. This wasn't just greed, it was desperation. My son and his wife were drowning, and they were reaching for me as their lifeline, even if it meant pulling me under with them. When David came back, Karen hung up quickly and forced a smile. Thank you for dinner, Mary, she said. It smells wonderful. But I hadn't cooked. The house was still quiet, still heavy. They left not long after David, clutching the folder like a man carrying gold, not knowing it was empty of power. I watched from the window as they drove away, tail lights fading down the dark road. Then I walked to the kitchen phone and dialed Walter's number. He answered on the second ring. Mary. He wants power of attorney, I said quietly. I signed it, but he hasn't notarized it yet. Walter's voice was sharp, quick. Good, that gives us time. Mary, we need to move fast. Tomorrow morning, can you come to my office? Walter's words echoed in my ear long after I hung up the phone. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the kitchen clock, but my mind was anything but still. I stood there staring at the dark window pane, my reflection faint against the night. Time. That was what I needed most and what David thought I didn't have much of. But he was wrong. I still had time, and I was going to use every bit of it. The next morning, I drove to Walter's house just as the sun was climbing over the trees. He lived in a modest colonial on Maple Hill, the kind of house with a porch that looked like it had witnessed half a century of quiet wisdom. Walter opened the door before I could knock. His hair had gone completely silver since I last saw him, but his eyes were still the same kind sharp, seeing more than you said. Come in, Mary, he said, ushering me toward his study. You brought everything. I nodded, setting the folder on his desk. Inside were the documents I'd collected, the unsigned power of attorney, copies of bank statements showing David's recent withdrawals, photos of my ripped credit card, and the recordings I'd saved from the birthday party. Walter sifted through each one, slowly reading in silence. When he finally looked up, his face was grave. "Mary," he said softly, "this isn't just family trouble. This is financial elder abuse. You could report him." I met his eyes. "I don't want him arrested, Walter. I just want him to understand what he's done and stop before he destroys everything." He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Then we have to do this carefully. Step 1, secure your assets before he gets that POA notarized. Step 2, let him think he's winning. Step 3, at the right moment, show him what he's really lost." He opened a fresh legal pad and began writing. "The good news is, George made sure your house is solely in your name." He was smart. "That means David can't touch it unless you sign it over willingly. And your savings account from George, the one David doesn't know about, that's our leverage. We'll move that into a new account at a different bank under your maiden name, Henderson." "Right. Yes," I said. "Mary Henderson." Walter smiled faintly. "Perfect. We'll make sure David can't trace it. Use a small local credit union. I'll help you set it up." He looked up at me, his tone turning practical. "You'll transfer George's $85,000 into that new account. It's safe money, untouched and separate. That will buy you time." I listened, nodding slowly as he laid out the steps. There was a sense of comfort in his precision, a rhythm I recognized from my own days of balancing ledgers and organizing estate plans. It was strange I hadn't felt this steady in years. He pulled open a drawer and took out a small white box. "One more thing, a doorbell camera. It's easy to install. If David shows up unannounced or pressures you, we'll have evidence. These days, video speaks louder than any affidavit." I took the box, feeling its weight. "You've thought of everything. I've seen this too many times, Mary," he said quietly. "Sons, daughters, nephews, they start small, convincing themselves they're just helping. Then it becomes control, and control turns into exploitation. The difference is, you saw it early enough to stop it." He paused, then added, "We should also think about the long-term solution, a living trust. I can draft one for you. You'll be the trustee, meaning you control everything. When the time comes, your beneficiaries, whoever you choose, will inherit directly. No probate, no interference, not even from someone with power of attorney." "A living trust," I repeated. The term rolled off my tongue like an old habit, one I hadn't used since my working days. Walter nodded. "I'll draft it this week. Once the trust holds your house and your savings, David will have no legal access. Even if he manages to notarize that POA, it won't matter. The trust supersedes it." I exhaled slowly. He won't see it coming. "That's the point," Walter said, scribbling a note. "Let him think he's in control. The more confident he is, the less careful he'll be. We'll use that." Before I left, I hesitated at the door. "Walter," I said softly, "there's something else. I found foreclosure notices, addressed to David. He's about to lose his house." Walter's expression darkened. "That explains his desperation. Bling, a bad investment. I don't know yet," I said. "But I need to find out how bad it is." He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Be careful, Mary. Desperate men do desperate things. You're playing a long game here, one that requires patience and proof. Don't corner him. Let him come to you." I nodded, clutching the small box in my hands. "I will." As I drove home, I felt the shift fully settle in. The fear that had lived in me these past weeks had thinned into something else: clarity. I wasn't just an aging mother anymore. I was a woman, reclaiming control. Every detail mattered now, every choice. That evening, I brewed myself a cup of chamomile tea and opened the doorbell camera box. The instructions were simple enough. I installed it beside the front door, the quiet click of the latch satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. When it was done, I stepped back, wiping my hands on my apron. That's when I noticed it. At the end of the street, half shrouded by the shadows of the maple trees, was David's car. The engine was running its headlights off faint exhaust curling into the night air. He wasn't moving, just sitting there watching my house. I stood there in the doorway, staring straight toward him. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly, the car shifted into gear and rolled away down the dark road. After that night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound made me sit up, half expecting his headlights to return. I wasn't afraid in the way I used to be. This was something different, a kind of sharp alertness, like the air before a storm. Walter had told me to stay calm, but deep down, I knew something was changing. David was getting desperate. I could feel it in the way his messages came shorter, his tone tighter. He was losing control, and desperate people make reckless decisions. It was Wednesday when he stopped by just to check in. He said it with that forced lightness that always came before a demand. "How are you doing?" "Mom need anything?" he asked, glancing around the kitchen as if counting my groceries. He looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from running out of options. I poured him coffee, though he barely touched it. He talked about work, the kids, the usual small talk that didn't mean anything. Then he excused himself to use the bathroom. His phone buzzed on the table, lighting up the screen. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. The preview flashed across the top of the display before fading to black final warning David. $80K due by end of month or we proceed with legal action. Ace Recovery Services, $80,000. My hand froze midair. The number pulsed in my mind like a siren. By the time he returned, I'd moved the phone back exactly where it had been. He didn't notice. He smiled, then distracted, and left soon after, muttering something about business calls. I stood there long after the door closed, my chest tight. 80,000. What could he have done? The next day, I went to the bank to transfer the last of George's hidden savings into my new account under my maiden name, just as Walter had advised. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, smiled politely as she processed the paperwork. While I waited, her computer screen flickered, and for a brief second, I saw a name in the corner of her monitor. Thompson, David, account overdrawn, 3 hours, 2:47. She quickly switched screens when she noticed my glance, her face turning a little pink. "Sorry, system lag," she murmured, pretending it hadn't happened. But it was too late. I had seen it. By the time I got home, I was shaking, not from fear, but from realization. His account was empty. He was in debt. His house was under foreclosure. And he owed someone $80,000. That night, I sat by the window with the lights off, thinking about every conversation we'd had over the last few months. The sudden urgency. The insistence on controlling my finances. The papers. The joint account, the power of attorney. It all clicked into place like a puzzle I hadn't realized I was assembling. The final piece came on Friday. I was in the living room reading when I heard a voice outside, David's voice. I looked at the screen of my laptop. The doorbell camera was recording. He was pacing on the porch, phone pressed to his ear, his tone sharp and anxious. "I told you I'll have the money," he said. "My mother's house is worth $400,000 clear title. Once I get her to sign it over, we sell fast. I pay you back with interest. Yes, I have power of attorney, well, almost. Just need to notarize it. Look, just give me 2 more weeks." My stomach twisted. My own son was negotiating with a debt collector using my home as leverage. I could hear the desperation in his voice, the same voice that used to beg for an extra cookie when he was 10, or promise he'd pay me back when he borrowed money at 25. But this wasn't about small favors anymore. This was about survival, and he'd chosen me as the price. When he left, I replayed the footage 3 times, each time feeling a new wave of disbelief. It wasn't anger that hit me first, it was grief. Grief for the man my son used to be, for the way greed and shame had hollowed him out. But beneath that grief was something colder, steadier. Resolve. I called Walter as soon as the recording finished. He picked up after the first ring. "Mary, he's not just controlling," I said quietly. "He's drowning. Gambling debt, 80,000 at least. His own house is in foreclosure. His bank account's overdrawn. And he plans to sell mine to save himself." Walter didn't speak for a moment. When he did, his tone was clipped, all business. "Mary, this changes the timeline. He might act faster than we thought. We need to secure the house deed now. Monday morning, come to my office. We'll file the trust documents immediately." I agreed, my voice steady, even as my pulse quickened. "Monday morning, I'll be there." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet for a long time. The night outside was still, the moon casting soft light across George's garden. I thought of his letter, of his warning, teach him. Not destroy him, not punish him, but teach him what family truly meant. And I would. But lessons like that take time, and time was something I was running out of. Sunday morning, I woke to pounding on my door. It was David, face red, eyes wild. "Mom, I need you to sign something. Today. Right now, it's an emergency." That was how it began, the last desperate push before the calm. He stood there on my porch, his breath uneven, papers clutched in his shaking hands. His voice carried that old edge, the one that used to make me shrink back when he was younger and angry about something he couldn't control. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I looked at him, quiet and steady, and said, "Not today, David. I have plans." His face twisted. He tried to argue, to explain, to guilt me. "Mom, please. You don't understand." I didn't answer. I simply closed the door. By the next morning, I was sitting in Walter's office. The smell of old wood and paper filled the small study he'd turned into a workspace after retiring. He listened as I told him everything: David's visit, the pounding on the door, the wild look in his eyes. When I was done, he leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin. "We move now," he said, "before he finds another way." We drafted the living trust that morning, the Thompson Family Trust. My name stood as the sole trustee. The beneficiaries, Karen and my 2 grandchildren, Emma and Jake. Not David, never again. Walter explained each clause slowly, making sure I understood. "This will protect your assets. Once the house deed is retitled, no one can sell or touch it without your signature. Not even a power of attorney can override a trust." I nodded. He warned me the process might take 2 or 3 weeks, the legal filings, county recorder approvals, stampings. But the moment it was done, my home would be safe. The next few weeks moved like a quiet storm, slow, deliberate, heavy with purpose. I went through the motions of my days, careful to let David see what he wanted to see. When he stopped by unannounced, I made sure to stumble over words, to forget the day of the week. I called Emma by the wrong name once. Sarah, my childhood friend, and David immediately took the bait. "See Karen. She's slipping. We need to act fast." His voice was full of false concern, but I caught the flicker of relief in his eyes. He thought time was on his side. He didn't know I had already moved George's savings, $85,000, into a new bank account under my maiden name, Henderson. He didn't know the house he planned to sell was now in the process of being retitled under a trust that excluded him entirely. and he certainly didn't know that every word he spoke near my porch or doorway was being recorded by the small camera Walter had helped me install. Week 5 brought a kind of uneasy peace. The paperwork moved through the county recorder's office. Walter called regularly with updates. "They've stamped the deed," he said one morning. "We're just waiting for final recording. Once it's on the books, the trust is untouchable." I spent those days tending to George's roses, keeping my hands busy, while my mind stayed sharp. The scent of them, the same kind he used to plant every spring, gave me strength. It reminded me that patience, not panic, wins the long game. David continued to call sometimes twice a day. "Mom, I've been talking to a realtor. Just exploring options in case you want to downsize." His tone was casual, but the push behind it was anything but. I pretended to forget the earlier conversation. "Oh, that's nice, dear," I'd say softly. "I do get tired of these stairs sometimes." His sigh of relief through the phone almost made me pity him. Almost. By week 6, Walter called again, his voice warm with finality. "Mary, it's done. The house is officially recorded under the Thompson Family Trust. Even if David notarizes that power of attorney, it's meaningless now. The trust supersedes everything. Your assets are secure, your savings, your home, it's all protected." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I walked out to the garden phone pressed to my ear and sat down by the rosebush George had planted the summer before he passed. The petals brushed against my wrist, cool and soft. "Thank you, Walter," I said quietly. "For everything." He hesitated before replying. "Mary, this isn't over. He'll notice soon. When he does, you need to be ready." I smiled faintly, watching a bee hover over a blossom. "I am ready." Now comes the hard part, teaching my son. After we hung up, I stayed in the garden for a long time. The sun slipped behind the trees, and the air turned golden, then gray. I thought about the years of raising David, the scraped knees, the school plays, the first heartbreak. I'd given him everything thinking love alone would keep him grounded. But love without boundaries is like a gate left open. It invites danger. I walked back inside, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The house felt still for the first time in months, almost as if it too understood it was safe. I was exhausted, but it was the kind of exhaustion that comes after finishing something important. My hand brushed over the stack of documents Walter had given me, neatly filed and sealed. The legal proof of what I had fought for. Not revenge, but protection, dignity, peace. The phone rang just as I set down my cup. The sound startled me. It had been hours since I'd heard another voice. I reached for it, expecting Walter's familiar, calm tone, but it wasn't him. It was Karen. Her voice was shaky, uncertain. "Mary," she said softly, almost whispering, Can I come over? Alone? There's something I need to tell you." Her words hung in the air long after the line went dead. I agreed, of course. I told her to come by any time, but she never showed. The rest of that evening passed in a quiet unease I couldn't shake. I told myself she might have changed her mind, that maybe David had come home early. Still, her voice low, trembling, stayed with me. It was the first time I'd heard real fear in it. By Friday afternoon, life had settled back into its quiet rhythm. I was getting ready to leave for my shift at the library when I realized I'd forgotten my reading glasses. I locked the door, started the car, and drove halfway down the block before turning back. Without my glasses, everything at the library looked like a blur, and I'd grown tired of pretending my eyes were younger than they were. When I returned, the parking spot in front of my house was taken, so I pulled around the corner and walked. It wasn't until I rounded the hedge that I saw Karen's van parked at the curb. I stopped. She had told me earlier that morning she was too busy to visit, that Emma had choir practice, that she had errands. But there she was, sitting in her van, the engine off the windows cracked open just enough to let in the warm air. I smiled to myself, thinking maybe she'd come to surprise me, or perhaps to finally talk about whatever had made her voice tremble that night. I walked closer, meaning to tap on her window. Then I heard her voice. "I know, but we don't have a choice," she was saying. Her tone clipped urgent. "His gambling debts are $80,000. Our house is in foreclosure. What else are we supposed to do?" "Yes, her house." David feels guilty, but I keep reminding him she's 68. She lives alone. She can barely manage it. If we sell it, we clear everything and can still afford the lake house we wanted. She already signed the power of attorney. He just needs to get it notarized. No, she doesn't suspect anything. She thinks we're helping her. The words slid through me like ice. I froze inches from her window, unable to breathe. Karen's voice, calm, rational, almost bored, spoke of my life as though it were an equation to be solved. A transaction. I stepped back slowly, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. My knees felt weak, but I managed to steady myself against the hedge. I had prepared myself for David's betrayal. In some corner of my mind, I'd known it was possible. He had always been impulsive, easily swayed by greed and fear. But Karen, the quiet daughter-in-law who brought flowers on Mother's Day, who cried at George's funeral, who told me once she saw me as the mother she never had. I had believed she was caught in the middle. Someone enduring David's arrogance because of love or obligation. I was wrong. It wasn't endurance. It was calculation. I stepped away from the van, afraid she'd see me through the glass. My breath came shallow and quick. She kept talking, unaware of the world beyond her little bubble. "No, she won't live that long," I heard her say. "Even if she finds out, what's she going to do? Sue us? She doesn't even understand half of what's going on." I couldn't listen anymore. I turned and walked back to my car, each step heavier than the last. Once inside, I closed the door and gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The tears came slowly at first, then all at once. Silent, hot, unstoppable. Not the kind of crying that cleanses, but the kind that burns. All this time, I had thought Karen was the one person who might protect my grandchildren from David's recklessness. I had intended to leave her the house to trust her with it, believing she would use it for the children's future. I had been planning to show her that trust, to give her something stable, something she'd earned through kindness. And yet, she'd been plotting to sell it all along, dreaming of some lake house I'd never see. I stayed there in the car until the shaking stopped. Then I did what I always did when the world tried to knock me down. I reached for the phone. Walter answered on the second ring. "Mary Karen." I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "She's the one pushing him. She wants the lake house." There was a pause, the soft sound of papers rustling on his end. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "but this is actually important information. It means we know everyone's motivation now, and it means Karen might be swayed." "Swayed?" My voice cracked slightly. "Walter, she's been planning to sell my house." "Yes," he said carefully. "But if she learns that David lied to her about the debt amount, or if she realizes she can save herself and the children without him, she might turn. We can use that, Mary. Sometimes the person who betrays you can also become the key to exposing the truth." I sat there in silence, watching the afternoon sun filter through the windshield. The ache in my chest was sharp, but under it was something firmer resolve. "You're saying she could be turned against him?" "I'm saying she already doubts him," Walter replied. "You just need to give her the right reason to choose differently." For a moment, I thought of George, his calm voice, his steady faith in people. "Teach him," he had written. But now I understood. Teaching sometimes meant letting the truth destroy what was false. I wiped my cheeks, took a slow breath, and stared out at my house, my home, the place I had built and almost lost. My voice was steady when I spoke again. "Walter, I said I want to do the dinner. Next Saturday. Invite who we discussed. It's time to end this." The plan had been made in one breath, and from that moment forward, I didn't waver. Monday morning came with a clear blue sky, the kind George used to call forgiving weather. I stood at the kitchen counter, the phone in my hand, and dialed David's number. He answered on the third ring, his voice clipped, cautious. "Mom." "Hi, dear," I said softly, letting the sound of fatigue edge into my words. "I was thinking, I want the whole family to come over for dinner this Saturday. I have something important to talk about." He hesitated. "About what?" "The house," I said, sighing like someone who'd made peace with a hard truth. "You're right. I can't manage it alone anymore. I think it's time to sign it over to you. But I want the whole family there. It feels right to do it that way." There was a pause, and I could almost hear the shift in his tone. The suspicion melted into excitement. "Really? Are you sure, Mom?" I kept my voice gentle. "Yes, David. I'm sure." 6 o'clock Saturday. When I hung up, I stood for a long moment staring at the phone, the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock filling the air. I could almost see George sitting across from me, arms folded, that knowing smile tugging at his mouth. "You've got him now, Mary," I could hear him say. And I had. By Tuesday morning, the wheels were turning. Walter confirmed first. "I'll bring everything. Trust papers. Your will, the financial statements, even the foreclosure letters," he said. "We'll have copies for everyone. You want truth? We'll give them truth." Neighbor Susan didn't hesitate either. "Mary, after what I saw at Jake's party, I wouldn't miss it for the world," she told me over coffee. I thanked her, though I hated that my humiliation had become her motivation. Then Pastor Mike agreed. "You've been the heart of this community, Mary," he said gently. "If you're doing this to bring light to something dark, you're doing God's work." By Thursday, everything was in motion. I called each of them again to confirm the timing. 6:30 sharp, I reminded them. "Come after David's family arrives. I want witnesses, but not an audience." Walter's quiet voice on the other end steadied me. "You've got this, Mary." That night, I stood at my bedroom window, the moonlight pouring through the curtains. I thought of the years I'd spent second-guessing myself, the years of shrinking to keep the peace, of excusing David's behavior with words like stress and pressure. No more. I had been silent too long. Friday came with a heaviness in the air, the kind that warns of rain. I was kneading dough for the apple pie when I heard the knock. When I opened the door, it was Karen holding a grocery bag in both hands. "I thought I'd help you bake for tomorrow," she said, with a small, uncertain smile. I stepped aside and let her in. We worked quietly side by side, measuring flour, slicing apples, the air filled with cinnamon, and something unspoken. Twice she started to say something, Mary, but stopped. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the crust into the pan. Finally, when the pies were in the oven, she turned to me. "Are you sure about tomorrow, about signing over the house?" I wiped my hands on a towel and met her eyes. "Why do you think I shouldn't?" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. I want you to be happy, that's all." I studied her for a moment, the guilt written all over her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of something she hadn't confessed yet. I wondered how much sleep she'd lost since the day in the van. "I will be," I said gently. "Tomorrow's about doing the right thing, for the family." She nodded, but couldn't meet my eyes. When she left an hour later, she hugged me tightly, longer than usual. I stood in the doorway and watched her walk to the van, her steps slow, uncertain. That night, I took out the manila folders I'd prepared and placed them on the dining table. One contained everything Walter had organized: the trust papers, the will, the bank statements, the debt letters, even a small USB drive with the recordings from the doorbell camera. The second folder was thinner, simpler: a letter addressed to Karen and a document offering her a choice, one that could change everything. By Saturday morning, the sky had cleared. I woke before sunrise, as I always did, and began cooking. The familiar rhythm soothed me: the sizzle of the pot roast, the smell of rosemary and thyme, the hum of the dishwasher running in the background. I set the table carefully, laying out the white linen tablecloth, the good silverware, the tall candles. Fresh flowers from George's garden stood in a vase at the center. It looked beautiful, like a celebration. At noon, Walter called to confirm. "Everything's ready," he said. "We'll arrive at 6:30. Mary, are you sure you're up for this?" "I've waited a long time to be heard," I replied. "I'm more than ready." By 5:30, the food was warm in the oven, the table gleaming under the soft light. I went to my bedroom, brushed my hair, and put on my favorite blue dress, the one George always said made my eyes look bright. I pinned on the small silver brooch he'd given me on our 25th anniversary and stood before the mirror for a moment, studying the woman looking back at me. Older, yes, but not weaker. Not anymore. As the clock struck 5:45, headlights appeared in the driveway. I took a slow breath, smoothed my dress, and put on my reading glasses. My hands didn't shake. When the knock came, I was already at the door. I opened it with a gentle smile. "Come in, dears," I said softly. "Let's talk about the future." David brushed past me first, carrying his leather briefcase like a prize he couldn't wait to show off. Karen followed, pale and silent, her eyes darting around the dining room as though memorizing every corner. Emma and Jake came last, their young faces lighting up at the sight of the food. "Grandma, this smells amazing," Jake said, his voice bright and innocent. Emma leaned in to hug me, and for a brief moment, I felt the ache of what this family could have been. Dinner began almost like any other, almost. I served pot roast and mashed potatoes, and the children laughed as they reached for the rolls. But beneath the soft clatter of plates, tension hummed like an electric current. David's eyes kept flicking toward the manila folder at the end of the table, the one I had placed so deliberately. Karen's hands trembled each time she lifted her fork. She barely touched her food. I kept my smile steady, though my heart was a storm behind my ribs. For all the weeks of preparation, nothing truly readied a mother for this, to face her own son and reveal just how far he had fallen. "Everything okay, dear?" I asked gently, my eyes on Karen. She nodded too quickly, her throat tight. Halfway through the meal, David finally broke the fragile quiet. "Mom," he said, wiping his mouth with his napkin, "we need to talk about the house." I set my fork down slowly. "Can't we finish dinner first?" He shook his head, impatient. "No, now. I brought the transfer forms with me." He pulled a thick stack of papers from his briefcase and laid them flat on the table. "These are quitclaim deed forms. You sign, I'll file them Monday, and the house will officially transfer to my name. Then I'll handle selling it and getting you into a nice apartment, something low maintenance." Karen flinched at the word selling, and I noticed Emma's fork pause midair. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping my tone calm. "You've already decided all that, have you?" David exhaled, as if explaining to a stubborn child. "Mom, this isn't about deciding. It's about protecting you. You said yourself this house is too much for you." "Yes," I murmured, I did say that. I reached toward the end of the table and pulled the other folder, the one I'd kept waiting. My fingers didn't shake as I opened it and drew out several printed letters. I placed them neatly in front of him. Before I sign anything, David, do you want to explain these? He frowned, then glanced down. The color drained from his face. His hand hovered over the papers, then froze. Where did you get those? Karen leaned in to look, and her hand flew to her mouth. David, $80,000. You told me it was 20. Emma's eyes widened. Dad? Jake looked between them, confused. What's going on? David stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. You went through my private papers, he demanded. I didn't raise my voice. No. You left one in my yard weeks ago. And then I heard you on the porch talking on the phone about selling my house to pay off gambling debts. Karen gasped. Gambling? David, you promised, you swore you stopped. He turned on her with a look I had seen before, cornered, furious, desperate. You wanted this too. You said we needed her money to get out of debt. You wanted the lake house, Karen. She stared at him, speechless. I wanted stability, David. Not this. Emma pushed back from the table. Dad, is this true? He opened his mouth, but no words came. His face was blotched red, his jaw tight, and I could see the fear creeping in, now the realization that the lies had finally run out. I reached for my glass of water and took a slow sip. I didn't plan to embarrass you, I said softly. But since you've brought your papers, I thought it was only fair we look at everyone's together. David's voice cracked. Mom, you don't understand how bad it's gotten. I was just trying to fix it by taking everything I built with your father, I interrupted quietly. The silence that followed was heavy enough to make the air itself feel thick. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of what was unraveling around them. Karen's hands shook so badly, she dropped her napkin. David, how could you hide this from me? He sank back into his chair, his face pale, eyes darting toward the front door as though looking for escape. We just needed time, he muttered. I could have fixed it if he stopped when I stood up. My chair scraped softly against the floor. I walked to the head of the table and rested my hand on the folder again. My voice was calm, but it carried enough strength to still the room. No, David. You weren't fixing anything. You were gambling again. You were lying. And you were planning to make your mother homeless to clean up your mess. The room went silent except for the faint tick of the dining room clock. I saw Karen's lips tremble. Emma's eyes fill, and Jake's confusion turned to something like fear. Then just as David opened his mouth to speak, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the tension like a blade. David froze, color draining from his face again. Who is that? He whispered. I turned toward the hallway, my voice steady and clear. The witnesses I invited, I said, because what I'm about to show you needs to be documented. David's eyes widened as the front door opened and 3 figures stepped in. Walter first, with his worn leather briefcase in hand, followed by Susan, my neighbor, and Pastor Mike, his kind eyes scanning the tense room. Emma leapt up. Mrs. Carver, she exclaimed, rushing to hug Susan. Jake looked from one face to another, confused. Grandma, what's going on? This is a private family matter, David barked, his voice echoing through the dining room. Walter didn't flinch. Actually, Mr. Thompson, he said, his tone calm but authoritative. Your mother asked us here as legal witnesses to ensure clarity and protection. She has every right to do so. He sat down at the end of the table and pulled out a yellow legal pad. Shall we proceed? Mary, I nodded once, then gestured for everyone to sit. My hands no longer trembled. The years of being talked over, dismissed, and ignored had worn me thin, but not weak. Thank you all for coming, I began, my voice quiet but firm. There have been misunderstandings, and I think it's time we clear them up. David scoffed. What misunderstandings? You said you were signing the house over to me. I did, I said evenly. But before we talk about that, I want everyone to see what I've actually done. I reached for the manila folder on the table and opened it. The soft sound of paper filled the silence. Document 1, I said, sliding out the first set of papers. The Thompson Family Trust, dated 6 weeks ago. You see, David, you wanted to sell this house. But you can't, because it's no longer mine alone. It belongs to the trust. I'm the trustee, and the beneficiaries are Karen, Emma, and Jake. David blinked, then leaned forward. What? I looked directly at him. You heard me. Even if I wanted to sell this house, I couldn't. Not without the consent of the beneficiaries. Karen's eyes widened. You put me and the kids in the trust. Yes, I said softly, because I wanted to make sure they had a home. A future. I pulled out the second document bank statements, and this, I continued, shows George's savings $85,000 transferred into a protected account. You can't touch a cent of it. That money will go toward the trust's upkeep and toward your children's education. David's face reddened. He reached for the papers, flipping through them as if he could find a mistake that would undo everything. You can't do this, he shouted. I have power of attorney. Walter spoke up before I had to. The power of attorney you asked her to sign was never notarized, he said evenly, which makes it legally invalid. And even if it had been assets held in a trust, supersede any power of attorney authority. You have no claim here. David's jaw dropped open. He slammed a fist on the table. I'm your son, your only child. How can you leave me with nothing? I looked at him steadily. You're not left with nothing, David. You're being given something far more valuable, a lesson. The words hung there. Even Pastor Mike's breath seemed to catch. I could see the fury and humiliation rise in David's face like a storm cloud. Karen's hand trembled as she picked up one of the papers, reading it with wide eyes. Mary, she whispered, you planned all this. I met her gaze. I plan to protect what your children deserve, and to give you a choice. From beneath the folder, I pulled out the second manila envelope, the one with her name written across the front in my handwriting. I slid it across the table toward her. This is for you, Karen. She hesitated, glancing between me and David before opening it. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. On the first was a simple statement. If Karen filed for divorce and took full custody of Emma and Jake, the trust would pay off her existing mortgage in full $180,000, ensuring the children had a home free and clear. The second sheet was a declaration from Walter confirming the trust's legal authority to execute that payment. Karen stared at the papers, her mouth slightly open. Mary, what is this? It's your chance to save your children, I said softly. You can keep your home secure, their future, and free yourself from this cycle. But you have to choose Karen. That man, I nodded toward David, has gambled away everything he's ever been given. You can follow him down that path or choose your children. David's head snapped toward her. Don't you dare, he growled, his voice breaking with anger. We're a family. He grabbed her arm hard enough that she gasped. Karen's breath caught. She looked down at his hand gripping her wrist, then back up at me. Tears spilling down her cheeks. Her voice shook, but the words came clear. David, let go of me. His hand dropped, and for the first time that night, silence filled the room. Not the uneasy kind that lingers before a storm, but the stunned quiet that follows it. Karen took one step back, then another, rubbing her wrist as tears welled in her eyes. "Mary," she whispered, her voice quivering. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." She stood there, shaking mascara streaking down her cheeks, eyes red and raw. "It was me," she said suddenly, and her words hit the room like a confession at church. "I pushed him. I was the one who told David to take over your finances. I told him to get power of attorney. I saw that lake house on Pinterest, and I wanted it, God, I wanted it so badly. Our house is falling apart. We're drowning in debt, and I just—" She broke down, covering her face with both hands. "I wanted something beautiful. I told myself it was for the family. But I was wrong. I was so wrong," Emma gasped softly. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling with confusion. Karen nodded through tears. "I know, sweetheart. I made terrible choices. I thought if I could just fix things, if we had something nice, it would make up for everything falling apart. But it doesn't. It never does." I stood and walked around the table slowly until I was beside her. She looked up at me ashamed, expecting anger. Instead, I took her hands in mine. They were cold and shaking. "Karen," I said quietly, "I know. I heard you on the phone last week." Her eyes widened in shock. "You knew," I nodded. "Yes. And still, I kept you in my will. Because I know you're a mother before you're anything else. You were scared. Fear makes good people do foolish things. But David—" I turned toward my son, who stood rigid by the table, his eyes darting between us. "David didn't act out of fear. He acted out of greed. He lied to you. Lied to me. Lied about how much he owed. He gambled away your family's future and planned to make me homeless to pay for it." Karen's expression changed. She turned to face him fully now, her tears giving way to something harder clarity. "You told me $20,000, she said, her voice rising. "You said it was a failed business investment. You swore it wasn't gambling anymore." David's face flushed crimson. "I was trying to win it back." She laughed once bitterly. "Win it back? That's what every gambler says before they lose everything. You lied to me for months. You let me beg your mother to sign papers she didn't need to sign all so you could dig us deeper." "Karen, please," he started. But she shook her head violently, stepping closer to me and the children. "No, I'm done." She turned to me, her voice shaking but resolute. "I choose them. I choose our children." She crossed the room, sat beside Emma and Jake, and pulled them close. Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder, crying silently. Jake sat stiffly staring at his father with wide, disbelieving eyes. Walter rose slowly, his voice steady. "Mr. Thompson," he said, addressing David with calm authority, "I am here not only as your mother's friend, but as her attorney. You are hereby served with a cease and desist notice." He pulled a single folded document from his briefcase and laid it on the table. "You are to cease all attempts to access or influence your mother's financial affairs. Any further contact regarding her finances will be considered harassment and elder financial abuse." David's head snapped toward Walter, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Walter continued. "Additionally, Mrs. Karen Thompson has consulted with legal counsel regarding separation. Papers will be filed Monday morning. You will be served formally at your residence." Karen looked down, clutching her children tighter. "It's true," she whispered. "I can't let them live like this anymore." The room felt heavier with every breath. I could see my son's composure crumble, the pride that once fueled him, replaced by a hollow, desperate confusion. He looked around the table for someone to side with him, but all he saw were faces turned away. Susan sat quietly. Pastor Mike bowed his head. Walter began packing his briefcase. Even his own wife and children were beyond reach. He stumbled back a step, his voice cracking. "You're all against me, every single one of you, Engel. You think you're better than me." I met his eyes one last time, and for a fleeting second, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who used to pick flowers from George's garden for me on Mother's Day, who once promised he'd always take care of me. But that boy was gone, replaced by the man before me, now drowning in his own choices. David grabbed his coat and walked to the door, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. He turned back, face twisted with pain and fury. "You've destroyed this family." My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. "No, son, you did. The moment you saw your mother as a bank account instead of a person. Leave your key on the table." He didn't speak. He just stared at me with eyes I didn't recognize anymore, then set his key down beside his half-finished dinner and walked out into the night. I didn't see him again for weeks. The morning after, the silence in the house was heavier than usual, but it wasn't sorrowful. It was still almost peaceful. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the kitchen window, watching the light stretch over George's roses. The confrontation had cost me my son, but it had also freed me from his control. Walter came by that afternoon to check on me, and we spent an hour going over the legal confirmations, the trust, the will, the cease and desist. Everything was officially recorded and unassailable. "You're safe now, Mary," he said before leaving. "You've done what few people have the courage to do." By Monday, Karen had filed for divorce. She came to tell me in person, her eyes red but steady. "It's time," she said simply. "For the kids, for myself." I hugged her, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. Over the next few weeks, David moved out of their home and into a small one-room apartment above a laundromat. The creditors came next. His wages were garnished, his car repossessed. The debt collectors called so often that he stopped answering his phone. I didn't rejoice. I just felt a deep, tired sadness. It wasn't revenge, I'd wanted only truth. By the end of that first month, even the children refused to see him. Emma told me one Sunday afternoon, her voice small and unsure. "Grandma, I told Dad I won't visit until he gets help. Mom says that's fair." I nodded, brushing her hair from her face. "It's more than fair, sweetheart. It's love. Real love tells the truth, even when it hurts." Between weeks 10 and 16, the town began to whisper. Small towns always do. Susan and Pastor Mike hadn't said much, but their presence at the dinner had been enough for people to know something happened. At church, I noticed the way some people's faces fell when they saw David's name on the community board. Word had spread how he'd tried to take control of his elderly mother's money, how he'd humiliated her, how it had all backfired. Former friends crossed aisles to avoid him in the grocery store. One man I barely knew pulled me aside in the parking lot and said, "I don't know the details, Mrs. Thompson, but whatever you did, good for you." Too many folks don't stand up for themselves. I didn't know whether to smile or cry, maybe both. David kept his job, but barely. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he biked to work every morning, now rain or shine. Some of his co-workers wouldn't eat lunch with him anymore. And one afternoon, as he stood outside the grocery store, a man told him coldly, "My mother's 70. If you ever come near her, we'll have a problem." That one hurt to hear. Because even if David deserved consequences, hearing that my son had become the town's cautionary tale twisted something deep inside me. Karen, on the other hand, began to bloom. The trust paid off her mortgage just as Walter and I had arranged. She and the children stayed in their home. She found a full-time position as a school administrator and took pride in earning her own way. Every Sunday, she and the kids came to my house. We cooked, gardened, and played board games together. Sometimes she'd linger afterward, helping me wash dishes as the kids played in the yard. One evening, she said softly, "You taught me something, Mary. That strength isn't cruelty. It's protecting what matters." "Thank you." I smiled and squeezed her hand. "You did the hard part, Karen. You chose what was right." Life settled into its new rhythm. The house was full of laughter again, not George's voice, not David's, but the giggles of my grandchildren, the hum of life returning to where fear used to live. The roses bloomed late that summer, fuller than they had in years. Sometimes I caught myself talking to George while I watered them. "You'd be proud of them," I whispered once. "You'd be proud of me too, I think." About 3 months after that night, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting was uneven and childish, and when I opened it, my heart swelled. "Dear Grandma, Mom told us everything. What Dad tried to do. We're so ashamed. But we're also so proud of you. You protected us even though it meant losing Dad. We want you to know we'd rather have you and Mom and this house full of love than any lake house with someone who forgot what family means. We love you. Thank you for being strong. Emma and Jake." I pressed the paper to my chest and cried, not the way I had that night after David stormed out, but the kind of crying that cleanses you, that makes room for peace. 6 months after that terrible Saturday night, I was reading to children at the library. I felt someone watching. I looked up and my breath caught. David stood at the entrance, thinner, older, wearing a janitor's uniform. And he was crying. He was thinner than I remembered. His shoulders slumped under the weight of something heavier than time, and his hands, once so confident, looked rough and worn. For a moment I couldn't move. My voice caught in my throat as the last of the children filed out of the library, their laughter fading into the quiet of the afternoon. He stayed at the door, not daring to come closer, eyes red, holding his cap in both hands like a man at confession. "Mom," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I don't expect forgiveness. I wanted to tell you that I'm trying." I didn't say anything right away. The clock ticked softly in the corner, the faint smell of old books hanging in the air. He took a shaky breath. "I've been in Gamblers Anonymous. 4 months clean. I see a therapist every week. I got a job here, custodian nights mostly. Minimum wage, but it's honest. I'm trying to be better." He looked smaller somehow, not just thinner, but humbled. The arrogance, the sharp edge that used to color every word he spoke, was gone. I still didn't move toward him. I just nodded. "I know," I said quietly. "Pastor Mike updates me every week." His eyebrows lifted, surprise flickering across his face. "You've been checking on me?" "Of course," I said softly. "You're still my son. But trust David, it's not something you ask for. It's something you earn back." Slowly. He nodded his chin, trembling. "I know. I deserve that." There was a long silence. The hum of the heater filled the space between us. Then he asked, almost in a whisper, "Can I see Emma and Jake?" I folded my hands in front of me. "That's not up to me," I said. "That's up to Karen and them. They're still hurt. You need to show them, not tell them, that you've changed. Actions, not promises, over time. Months, maybe years." He looked down at the floor and nodded again, swallowing hard. "I understand." His voice cracked. I want to make things right." I took a slow breath and stood walking toward the window, where the afternoon sun stretched across the garden outside. The roses George planted were starting to bloom again, stubborn as ever. "You know what I've learned, David?" I said, my voice steady. "Money can be replaced. Houses can be rebuilt. But dignity, trust, family, those take a lifetime to earn back once they're broken. Behind me, I heard him sniff a quiet sound of shame and sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything." I know, I said, turning to face him. "But sorry is just the beginning. You want to make things right. Show me. Show your children. Be the man your father always believed you could be." He nodded slowly, wiping at his eyes. "I will," he said, his voice barely audible. "I promise." For a moment, he looked like that boy again, the one who used to run across this very library lawn, holding up a report card he was proud of begging me to show George. I felt something stir inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to hope. He didn't try to hug me. He just nodded once more, stepped backward toward the door and said, "Thank you for letting me speak." I gave him a small smile. "Good night, David." "Good night, Mom." When he left, I stood there for a long time listening to the sound of the door closing softly behind him. The library felt quiet again, but not empty. It felt settled, like the air after a long storm. Susan came around the corner from the front desk a few minutes later, pretending to sort the returned books. "You okay, Mary?" she asked gently. "I am," I said. "For the first time in years, I truly am." She smiled and squeezed my arm before heading out, and I stayed to straighten the children's section. I picked up a stack of books, stories about courage, kindness, and family, and placed them neatly on the cart. It struck me how those were the same lessons I had spent my whole life trying to live by. To protect what mattered most, even when it hurt. As I turned out the library lights, I looked once more through the window. I could see David walking down the street, shoulders hunched against the cold, but there was a steadiness in his step I hadn't seen in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, he would find his way back, not to the house, but to himself. That evening, I went home and made myself a cup of tea. Karen had taken the kids to their piano lessons, and the house was quiet. I walked out into the garden with my cup and the framed photo of George I always kept by the bed. The roses were still blooming, stubbornly beautiful in the fading light. I sat on the bench beneath the maple tree, placed the photo beside me, and let the air settle around us. That evening, I sat in George's garden, roses blooming around me. I whispered to the photo I'd brought outside, "We did it, my love." Not by taking everything from him, but by protecting what mattered most. The children have their future. I have my dignity. And David has a chance to become the man you always believed he could be. That's not revenge, George. That's love. The hardest kind. And that's how it ended. Not with shouting or revenge, but with quiet strength, earned peace, and the kind of love that takes courage to give. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about protection. It's about showing others that dignity has value, that even when life tests you, you can stand tall, calm, and unbroken. Mary's story reminds us that strength isn't loud, it's steady. It's the kind that chooses understanding over anger, truth over fear, and peace over pride. If this story moved you, if you saw a little bit of yourself or someone you love in Mary's journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That's how we keep sharing more stories like this, stories that touch the heart, that remind us what family, forgiveness, and resilience truly mean. Now I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done in Mary's place? Could you find it in your heart to forgive, or would you have walked away for good? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is part of this conversation, and I read every single one. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for remembering that sometimes the quietest victories are the most powerful of all.